There have been some very interesting hardware wallet related stories in the news lately. One of the biggest ones is involving Trezor. Trezor gave their Tropic O1 chip. Now, Tropic O1 is sort of a subsidiary of Satoshi Labs, which also owns Trezor, so it's all sort of in the same family. And then the Ledger Donjon tested their Tropic O1 secure element chip and found a vulnerability and gave it to Trezor. And then based on that report, Trezor found an additional vulnerability and made all this public. And so I want to really focus on this story and kind of show you how the two companies work together to improve the crypto hardware wallet ecosphere. They are rivals when it comes to, their products, but they also work together quite a bit. But this is the big story that I wanted to focus on because it directly affects, the main focus of my channel, which is self-custody. So Trezor says your crypto is safe after Ledger audit exposes a hardware flaw. The flaw affects one of the wallet's multiple security layers and would require physical access, specialized equipment, and advanced expertise to exploit. Trezor disclosed a security flaw in their Tropic O1 chip used in its Safe 7 hardware wallet after Ledger's Donjon security team identified a successful laboratory attack, but the company says the vulnerability does not put user funds at risk. The flaw affects only one of the wallet's multiple security layers and would require physical access. I think we went over that. Specialized. They would have to have physical possession of the device. This is not a remote hack or flaw that can be exploited remotely, right? The attacker must have physical possession of the device and have special tools and knowledge in order to make this happen. But that's the story. Now, Trezor introduced their Tropic O1 chip in their latest model, the Trezor Safe 7, which, by the way, is one of my favorite devices. I've got a link down in the description if you want to check out the Trezor Safe 7. Very advanced chip and a big commitment to transparency on the part of Trezor. Ledger tends to focus on the secure element chip made by SD Micro is the name of the secure element chip that they use. And both the companies have a commitment to, what they feel is most important. Trezor values transparency and open source. Ledger tends to focus more on security. They use a closed source secure element chip, and their focus is that the secure element chip that they use has been battle hardened over the last 40 years. The company SD Micro has been making these chips for many, many years. They are secret by design, and they are hardened security. It's the same kind of security you use in the little chips that go in your ATM cards, in your credit cards, and in digital passports. So it's proven secure technology, but it is closed source. So that's Ledger's thing. Hey, we focus more on security. Trezor tends to focus more on the open source transparency and do the best they can on their security. A lot of people don't trust Ledger because they don't use open source technology. There's a whole big debate about this, but we're going to get into it a little bit. So using my links down below, you can get discounts on Ledger products or Trezor products. I don't play favorites. So their Tropic O1 chip is designed by a company called Tropic Square, which is kind of a very close related subsidiary of Trezor, a sister company of Trezor. So basically, Trezor created this Tropic O1 chip in order to be more transparent. They didn't want to use a prefabbed closed source chip. Now, we're getting into the guts of all this, but the chip is not necessarily or purely what a purist might call open source. It's auditable, which means that there is no NDA and anyone can audit the chip. That does increase transparency, but it is not per se open source. That term is thrown around a lot in the hardware wallet community. Open source really applies more to software projects. It's in its pure form, like Linux is an open source project. Bitcoin is an open source software project. And the idea behind open source is that anyone can look at the code, anyone can submit bug fixes, improvements. It's a whole ecosystem. But the difference between open source software and open source hardware is that I can download open source software and compile it and run the code and verify that it runs and inspect the code. But I can't really download open source firmware and run it and fab it onto my own secure element chip that I'm going to stick in a hardware wallet. That's a little beyond me and a little beyond most people. So when we talk about open source as it applies to hardware wallet chips, it's you're kind of getting into a little bit of gray area. But anyway, but I wanted to talk about how these two companies work together. And I'll just summarize this. This is the breaking story. This is Trezor's blog post. I've got this link down in the description where they explain exactly what happened. And then this is their X post where they talk about what happened. And then this is the Ledger Donjon blog post where they go into excruciating detail about how this attack occurred. So a few things I want to say about this whole situation. First of all, your funds are not at risk due to this security flaw that's been discovered. If someone were to get their hands on your Trezor Safe 7 device, there's a small chance that they might have the knowledge, the tools, and the know-how to exploit this flaw. But if you read this blog post, they were able, basically what the Donjon was able to do was introduce invalid firmware onto the device. Now, when you update the device on the regular firmware path, there are checks that make sure that firmware is valid firmware, right? Not invalid. Now, some people might call it malicious firmware. They were able to bypass the checks on the Tropico 1 chip that keep it from allowing invalid firmware. They were able to bypass that check. However, the Trezor Safe 7 uses more than one secure element chip. They actually use another secure element chip, which, by the way, is closed source, that they use to store the user's secrets, the user's private key, and the user's PIN. And just introducing this firmware did not give them a clear path to actually cracking the secrets. There's still another hardware wall in between those. But being able to introduce invalid firmware onto the chip is definitely a vulnerability. Now, as I mentioned, Trezor gave this chip to the Donjon to test. It was like, hey, will you test this chip for us? Because the independent testers there at the Ledger Donjon are like the best in the world. They have the best tools, the most experience. They've discovered lots of flaws in lots of different wallets, including their own, and then made them public or fixed them. That's the job of the Donjon. So Trezor provided that Tropico 1 chip, and the Donjon tested it, found this flaw, reported it to Trezor. It's not like Ledger made this public. They reported it directly to Trezor. Trezor, using that information, found more another flaw or similar flaw, deeper flaw. And so they kind of went back and forth over this. They're trying to make their chip better, make the ecosystem better. Now, if you look at Trezor's thing here, closed systems and NDA-protected secure element chips do the opposite, right? They believe open source is the best, right? So they're knocking NDA-protected closed source secure element chips, which Ledger uses, and everybody else, pretty much. And they do too, right? There's 2 chips on this Trezor Safe 7. But the Tropic 01 is the auditable, more transparent chip, hiding risks behind black box designs and forcing users to trust what they can't verify. Without transparency, it may be impossible for users to know whether the technology is at risk because companies can't disclose the vulnerability. All that is true, but there are trade-offs. If no one knows about it, then they can fix it before it becomes a vulnerability. Here's some hard facts. This vulnerability was discovered in the hardware of the Tropic 01 chip. Trezor can tell you all day long it doesn't affect your funds, and it doesn't at the moment, but they cannot fix this. They cannot update firmware to fix this problem. The only way to fix this problem is to update the chip itself, and so going forward, they'll have a fix for this. But the people that already own their products, they can't fix the ones that are already out there in the wild. So that's a hard fact. Now, another thing about their openness and transparency, because their firmware, it was open source, the Ledger Donjon was able to use that information to hone in on a particular operation because they could see the firmware was open source. So they were hitting that chip with laser during this firmware process. And so having the firmware open source made it easier for Ledger to isolate this problem, right? So as I said, it's not a remote hack, so don't go throwing away your Trezor device right now. I'm just kind of pointing out the reality of what this all means. So yes, transparency is a good thing, but may not always be totally applicable in a hardware wallet security environment, right? So there are 2 competing philosophies going on here. I like both companies. I like both products, but these are the hard realities. Now, also, what's very interesting, too, if you read, and if you've got some time, I would encourage you to read this, but it is pretty long and very, very technical. So your head will start spinning after a while. But if you read the entire article about how they discovered this vulnerability and pinpointed it, you'll see several sections where they praise Trezor for their philosophy and their chip, right? Yeah, they were talking about this mechanism here is very well designed. It prevented them from jumping to the Tropic 01 invalid firmware over to grabbing the secret of the end user. Or I'm sorry, the secrets that the user has stored, like the private key and the PIN. Those are stored in a separate area of the hardware wallet on a different secure element chip. So there's a lot of cooperation going back and forth between Trezor and Ledger, and then there's a lot of praise going back and forth between Ledger and Trezor. They're working together to make the entire ecosystem better over time. So, and you know, Trezor pointed out, why are we making this public? Because we want the ecosystem to improve. So kudos for both companies in this. And I think it's great that they're working together to expose flaws in the chip and try to improve going forward. Now, as I mentioned, I was talking with Charles. I interviewed him on my channel. And one of the things that Charles pointed out was that the SD microchip that Ledger uses is sourced from a huge company that has spent billions of dollars and over 40 years hardening their secure element chips. Whereas the Tropico 1 is a small company that is trying to match the same security as ST Micro, which is a $1 billion company that have spent 40 years hardening their secure element chips. So Charles thought that it's kind of wishful thinking for Satoshi Labs to think that they can make a chip that is just as secure as another chip that has billions of dollars in research and R&D and 40 years of, battle tested, as opposed to this small startup company that's building their own chip. That's up to you to decide which one you like better. So just out of curiosity, well, who's a Trezor fan and who's a Ledger fan?